Great to have you with us. I think most of you may know that we've just concluded a series on Nehemiah. Okay, so the rebuilding of the walls, but so much more than just the rebuilding of the walls. At the end of any series, I think at the end of any preach, there should be a question in our minds. The question should simply be, so what? So what? You've preached your guts out, so what? How does that affect me? How does that change me? What does that have to do with me? At the end of a series, we have to ask the same question. We've had 6-7 weeks of Nehemiah rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem, seeing the faith and the courage of those exiled being restored. And so what? So what made Nehemiah a role player of significance in his time? That's a significant word for this morning, the word significance. Acts chapter 13. In Acts chapter 13, verse 36. It's quite interesting that Acts chapter 13 would speak of King David. It's the last place you expect him to pop up. In any event, it says, "For when David had served God's purposes in his own generation, when he had served God's purposes in his generation, he fell asleep, was buried with his fathers, and his body decayed." When he had served God's purposes in his generation. So the question is, how did Nehemiah serve God's purposes for his generation? What is the legacy that Nehemiah left? How did he serve God's purposes in his generation? And surely then, because kind of again, so what? We have by now, I think, a great idea of how he served God's purposes. It's been 2,500 years since. So for us to answer that question regarding Nehemiah, it's a lovely historic question. This, write an essay on how Nehemiah served the purposes of God in his generation 2,500 years ago. Again, so what? So the actual question is, how am I serving God's purposes in my generation now? How do I live this life right now? What am I doing to serve God's purposes right now? So when and how did Nehemiah serve God's purposes? Was it when he was a wealthy cupbearer to the ruler, the king of probably the greatest empire of the world, of all time possibly, but definitely the greatest empire the world had ever seen at that time, where he lived in a place of importance, place of significance, a place of wealth and of privilege? Or was it when he was this rebuilder and restorer of the city of God and the people of God? What gave Nehemiah a place in history? A greater question is, what gave him a place in your Bible? It's not everyone that made it into the Bible. Actually have, your own book named after yourself. Not even written by yourself, but in any event. So what made him last? What turned his life that was already successful into a life of significance? Because many others were incredibly successful, but they didn't quite live the life of significance that actually brought them into our modern day Bibles. Okay, so was it when his heart broke for those things outside of himself, the things that went beyond himself, the things that mattered to God, the things that affected the name and the fame of his God? Initially, for the guys that missed it, back in our very first session on Nehemiah, the opening chapter, it says that one of his brothers, Hanani, came from Jerusalem, and he asked him about Jerusalem and about the people that were exiled, about the place and the people. And he gave this report. And then it said, and I sat down and wept. For days I mourned and fasted. And we said that wasn't just about the people and the place. It was actually because that represented the name and the fame of God. The city of God. In fact, in this week I saw a book on Tanya's desk, Jerusalem, the city of God. And it's just so reminded again, when we think of Jerusalem, we think of the city of God. So the city of God lying in ruins reminds you of a kind of a ruined representation of God. And the people of God being ashamed, living kind of in squalor, represented a God that's unable, an incapable God, a God that couldn't look after his people or his place. And that moved him. The fame of his God, the fame and the name of his God, that is what moved him. And so, was it when he moved for the fame and the name of his God, when he went beyond simply being moved, but when he actually did something about being moved, when he sacrificed, when he prayed, when he mourned, when he fasted? Or was it when his success depended on partnership with others in high places, the governors and the kings? Or was it when his success actually depended desperately on the God factor? God, if you do not come through, this is finished. I'm completely incapable of doing this. That which you've called me to do, that which you've burdened and placed on my heart, I'm incapable of doing this without you. Or was it when he allowed discomfort into his life? When he gave up his own comfort? When he gave up not only his position, but his time, his effort, his energy, his wisdom, his strategic thinking, but even his personal finances? Was it when he doggedly refused to come off the wall? When he doggedly refused to lay aside the things of God, the calling of God? Or was it when a nation repented and turned to God? Was that the actual moment when all the success rolled down into the moment of significance? The moment when an entire nation returned to God. You see, the account of Nehemiah, which we looked over for 6-7 weeks, is not a wall building exercise. It's not an exercise of rebuilding that which was before. But it was all about a nation and future generations being restored and being brought back to their God. This entire book, we can miss it so easily. We can make it about the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. We can build all the analogies about our building project and take the analogies and make it about our building project and kind of rah-rah and use analogies, and with that, kind of in a sense, manipulate towards this is where God is taking us. This is what we should all do. But was that success? Will that bring us success? Will it bring us lasting significance for generations? The moment, the true testing was when a nation returned to God. Yes, their wall was restored, and that brought about courage. But the courage restored faith. And so in Nehemiah 8, verse 17, it mentions that Israel had never served God in this way since the time of Joshua. So since Joshua, to the restoration of Nehemiah, not the restoration of the wall, but the restoration of the people's hearts, the return of their hearts to God, it's never been that same intensity in their love and worship of God since the days of Joshua. That is 800 years before. In an 800-year period, they have never been this stirred with so much fervor and so much passion for God for generations to come. That is the significance of Nehemiah. That's the take-home factor. That's the so what. The so what in my life. What is going to cause me to have the penny drop moment so that I will be stirred to such a place that I will serve God for generations to come. I've been reading, in fact, recently finished this book. It's called Halftime by Bob Buford. Halftime by Bob Buford. Thank you to Merve. I think it's quite a brilliant book. I also think he could have said most of it in that part of the book. But he decided to also add that part of the book. In any event, it's still a great book. I'm going to summarize it for you and help you. So, Halftime. Bob Buford starts off by quoting someone in the preference, or the preface, Peter Drucker. And he says, Peter Drucker says, we increasingly realize that modern government is incapable of taking care of community and social problems. Okay. This was written in America for the Americans about 30 years ago. First print. That was the forward for the first print. So back then, they realized that modern government is incapable, okay, of taking care of community and social problems. And then he says, and so is the free market. So don't think the answer lies in the free market out there. He says, therefore, there's a growing awareness that there's a need for a new sector. This new sector, he mentions, is a people going to church not because they are virtually forced to do so, but who go to church because they prefer to do so more than doing anything else. Because they are part of a mission. They're part of a missional church. That is the third sector that actually needs to arise. And so, with this in mind, Bob Buford starts off and he asks a question. And his question that he kicks off with is, what do I want to be remembered for? And so obviously we ask the question, it's his kind of so what question. We ask the question, what do we want to be remembered for? Firstly, individually, as households, and then corporately. What do we want to be remembered for? He says that we are spiritual beings, created with purpose, on purpose, for purpose, and destiny. Miraculously and wonderfully made in the image of God. It makes it therefore clear that we should desire a spiritual legacy. Buford then describes in his introduction to the book the concept of half-time. And he describes and compares life to a rugby game or a soccer game, and he compares it to the two halves of this game. He says, in life, we each have two halves. And then he says, during the first half of life, we chase after some form of success, whether it's business success, whether it's financial success, probably a similar thing, or success in sport, or something that will put my name up in lights, something that will make me feel that I've arrived, something that I can show off to someone, put on the mantelpiece, in a sense. But then he says, in the second half, our journey should start to lean towards significance and destiny. So from chasing success in the first half to in the second half, leaning more and more towards significance and destiny. And then 260 pages later, he concludes with the following thoughts. And so all those under 40, if you can just wake up again, because this is relevant for whichever side you're on, whichever half you're playing at the moment. I really do think this is relevant for all of us. He says that one of the significant differences between the first half and the second half is the nature of our Christian life. The nature of your Christian life looks quite different in the first half than in the second half. And he says it becomes much more integrated than being segregated in the first half. And what he means by that is, he says, it goes from being a personal, private faith to ministry as part of a lifestyle. It goes from what to believe to what am I actually going to do about what I believe. I love that. It's not just about defining what it is, what I believe, but it's actually deciding what am I going to do about what it is that I say I believe. This is a faith It's a faith that goes from letting go of stuff to a faith that actually means multiplication, abundance, wholeness, fruitfulness. From moving from the law and trying to fulfill and trying to tick the boxes to living in the grace, the fullness of the acceptance and the sonship of God. Moving from performance to position in God. Moving from Sunday Christianity to a 7 days a week, 24 hours a day reality Christianity. Moving from doctrine driven to actually purpose, call, vision driven. If you want to use the word driven. From doctrine to purpose to call to vision. And then on page 268, if you want to check it, he remarks, I know that I'm not the first person to suggest this. But then he says that the church needs to do a better job of interacting with the world. The church needs to be connected and switch on to the world. It's incredible that the stuff that myself and most other preachers say on a weekly basis, somebody else puts in a book and then sells 1 million copies. That's why I'm quoting him. Because somehow, it makes a lot of sense when he says it. The church needs to integrate with the world. Every believer, he says, I am certain, wrestles with this and truly wants to see the gospel transform culture. This guy should be a preacher. So he says, why doesn't it happen? He says he believes it comes down to individual responsibility. The church will never have credibility in the community at large without expressed individual responsibility. People need to see our faith and not only hear about it. I've also added in there in brackets, people should also see and hear what we stand for and what we are fighting for, rather than always hear what the church is against. Wonderful. I'm going to put that in a book and sell 1 million copies. He says, when our beliefs are personalized and privatized, practiced only inside a building once a week, we become one-dimensional, uninteresting. That's a beautiful euphemism for boring, uninteresting, and entirely self-centered. In other words, a bless me club. When we simply keep it to ourselves, we become one-dimensional, uninteresting / boring, and entirely self-centered bless me club. So, do you still remember the point of the book? The point was that he spoke about 2 halves, and the first half speaks about running after success, and then he moves towards significance. But he warns somewhere, sorry, I didn't give you the page number for that one, but at some stage, he warns that your first half will come to an end. For everyone, your first half runs out. By the way, your second half also runs out. He doesn't mention that as blatantly, but that's probably why he's selling more books than I am. So, your first half runs out, and then he says, unless you order your life around the fact that your first half is going to run out, then unless you do something about it, your second half, for your second half to be better than your first half, you will join, unless you've done something significant to plan and to prepare that your second half will be better than your first half, you will join those who aimlessly and mindlessly wander through life, sliding down to Sunny van der Spy. You can tell I'm no longer quoting him. Then your second half will be a slower and a beigeur version of the first half, with fewer moments of success and very little significance. I had a book on my desk. I think Andre took it. It was only a week ago. Thank you for Isaac for returning it, by the way. It's called Finishing Strong. And in Finishing Strong, he makes the point that only 1 in 10 will finish strong. And then he asks the question, so what intentional measures are you taking to ensure that you'll be the 1 in 10? You see, because when we read that, it's a magnificent book. It's really worth a read. When you read that, you always feel that I'll definitely be the 1 in 10. I really love God. And then he says, but he gives some statistics. And he uses some really well-known guys. And he even goes back to the 12 spies. And it's not quite 1 in 10, it's 2 in 12, but it's quite similar. Where they choose one man from every tribe. So imagine from the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin, whichever, whether it's the biggest or the smallest tribe, you are the one man chosen to represent that tribe to go and spy out the land, to come and bring a report back. It says, out of those, 10 gave a bad report, and only 2 gave a good report. So he continues to use different examples to show that in life, only 1 in 10 finishes strongly. In fact, that's where my quote comes from Dr. Paul Beck, same book. Remember what Dr. Paul Beck says? He says, stay close to Jesus. Make sure that you keep your heart close to Jesus every day, because it's a long way from where you are to where you are going to. And Satan is in no hurry to get you. And so Dr. Paul Beck gives his would-be son-in-law, he was still kind of courting his daughter at that stage, some advice. And he tells him the story of, he says, it's been my observation in life that for men who start out at the age in their mid-20s, serving God fervently, only 1 in 10 will still be serving God at the age 65. And the author of this book says he cannot believe that. So he was in seminary. It's different to a cemetery, slightly. And so he wrote down the names of all of his classmates because they were in final year about to go into the ministry. He said, and then as the years passed, he said at the time of writing of the book, I think he said he was 53 years old. He said during this time he crossed out names as men fell out of ministry, etc. And then he said of the 25 original names, at that age, 853, he had 3 names left. So the point is, I'm jumping from book to book here, but when he says 1 in 10 will stay standing, we think that's ridiculous. It's impossible. It's surely 9 out of 10. In this room, 9 out of 10 at least. But he kind of proves 1 out of 10. But then the clincher is, what exceptional, what extraordinary measures are you taking to ensure that you are the 1 in 10? And Beefwood could have said and could have used the same analogies, but he's saying, unless you take some exceptional measures, your second half will not be different to your first half. In fact, because we run out of energy and all the rests and so on, so he says, as we've heard, your second half will simply be a slower, more beige version of your first half, with fewer moments of success and much less significance. But if we wake up and if we sit up and if we, having quoted Sonny van der Spy, if we smell the melktert, if we take responsibility for the rest of our lives, then you'll begin to experience the abundance of God which God had intended for us, for you, throughout life. I didn't intend this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Will everyone above 60 please take a stand? Sure, Jean, close. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to see so many of you making decisions to live a life intentionally, making intentional choices to live a life of significance, to leave a legacy for generations to come. Thank you. You may be seated. Buford continues, he says, when I look across the Christian landscape, I see enough talent, enough gifting, enough creativity, enough compassion, enough money, enough strength to transform our culture. I love that. He says, I see true believers in every single sector of society, genuinely concerned about the condition of their communities, yet feeling powerless to do something significant and something lasting about it. It's not that we don't note the problem, that we're unaware of it. It's that we feel powerless to do something about it, to bring about change, not for a moment, but change not for a season, change that will actually be significant and that will last for generations to come. And so then he ends his bestseller with 3 points. He says, I've concluded that the first thing that is needed is, as we've mentioned, individual responsibility. It says individual responsibility is the key to transforming both the church and the culture. Because the culture can only be, Ephesians 3:10, the culture can only be transformed by the church. It says it was his intent, God's intent, that now through the church, his agency, that's us, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers, authorities in the heavenly realms, etc. It is through individual intent that we personally make a decision, and then through the church, because that's the only way we can do it corporately, collectively, we see a community changed. He says, and you have the choice. And that's why it's a bestseller, because it rhymes. You have the choice to make sure that the rest of your years will be the best of your years. Lovely. So the fact is, for all of those who stood, but all of those who didn't stand, didn't quite qualify to stand, you have the choice to make sure that the rest of your years can be the best of your years. Or you can clutch out, or clutch into neutral, downhill to San van die Spy. As I said, downhill to San van die Spy. In kan tref ek op die stem omgekeerd. Okay. Back to individual responsibility. The rest of your years can be the best of your years. And then he says, I want to pray, and my prayer for you is that you will have courage to live the dreams that God has placed inside of you. Only you can do it through the church. The rest of your years can be the best. You haven't kind of been just released into pasture. And that you may have the courage to live the dreams that God has placed within you. Dreams that go beyond you. Because every single person here realizes that to move from success to significance, we have to passionately pursue the dreams that God has placed within us with great courage and push through the opposition. So as we close, we will need to start getting those dancers together. We've spent 6 weeks on Nehemiah, looking at how he went about to rebuild these walls. And I'm quite sure that one of the things that encouraged us, that encouraged you, was that it was done by ordinary people. That really inspired me. Remember, they were the goldsmiths, the perfume makers, the merchants, and the residents that accomplished this. And they accomplished this in all of 52 days, in spite of severe opposition and even death threats. Severe opposition and death threats. And then it says, what was really inspiring, Nehemiah 6:16, the second part thereof, is that we realized our opposition, they lose their courage because their self-confidence, in fact it says. They lost their self-confidence because they realized that this great work was done with the help of God. This was done by the hand of God. And so, when we have ordinary people committing to the help of God, ordinary people combining with God, anything is possible. That is the message of Nehemiah. The goldsmiths, the perfume makers, the merchants, just the residents, kind of die res van ons. The untitled ones, the nameless, faceless ones. When they teamed up with God, this was done. You see, this is always the way of our God. This is the way that He works. He works in partnership. From the very beginning, God partners with Adam to create Eve. He partners with Noah to rescue a few. He partners with Abram to bring out what will later become a nation as numerous as the sand of the seashore. He partners with Moses to bring them out of Egypt. He partners with Joshua to take them into the promised land. During every single miracle of the New Testament, because those were all Old Testament examples, during every single miracle in the New Testament, there's partnering. There's our role. There's something that we need to do. From filling stone jars right up to the brim to filling, well, that's an Old Testament one as well, filling jars with oil, to going to wash your face 7 times in the Jordan, Old Testament, to asking for faith. We have a role to play. So God is a God of partnership. But God is also, and I love this word more, that's why I had to bring it in, God is also a God of covenant. And so He even partners with Jesus Christ on the cross to bring us into the partnership of the new covenant, a covenant with Him. And we need Him in this next season more than ever before. So we are called into partnership. We are called into a covenant with Him, and we need Him like never before. Which means that we need the courage to step out in faith and to partner with Him like never before. Somewhere in my notes I've missed this, but somewhere it says, the people must have realized that it's impossible for us to pull this off without God. We need God. But at the same time, they realized that God needs them. Sounds interesting, doesn't it? But remember, they were the ones who got going. They were the ones who cleared the rubble. They were the ones who stood side by side. They were the ones who ended up leaving no gaps. They were the ones who faced and overcame the opposition. They built the wall, stone by stone. Not a single stone, not a single brick, if you want to call it that, was laid in place by an angel. They did it. God partners with us. And so, this is our opportunity. This is our moment. This is our season to focus on having lasting significance for generations to come, not for mere momentary, temporary success. So come partner with us. Come partner with Liberty, with Grace Hill, and with God into something that is truly significant, something that will last for generations to come. Amen.